By the early 19th century, ideas of social and political change swept across Europe. Almost everyone agreed that change was required, but not everyone agreed on the nature of change required. The proponents of change in Europe were classified into several groups on the basis of their ideologies. Some of these groups were liberals, Democrats, socialists, nationalists, conservatives, and radicals. You'll now see some ideas held by each of these groups. Match each set of ideas with the correct group. We must tolerate all religions and have an elected parliamentary government independent of rulers. However, voting should only be restricted to men and particularly to men who own property. You got it! The government should represent the majority of the population. Women too should have the right to vote. Landowners and wealthy factory owners must not have unique privileges. Property ownership should not be restricted to a few people. You got it. We're not very open to change, but we seem to be the only ones holding on to the past. If there must be change, let it be slow. Individuals must not own private property. All property must be owned by society as a whole. We want a united identity. We want a nation where all people have equal rights. Society should operate on the basis of cooperatives where groups of people work together to produce goods and share the profits based on work done by each member. You got it! We're similar to the liberals in our opinions, but there's one big difference. We think that each and every citizen has the right to vote.
Up until the 20th century, Russia was still under autocratic rule. The Tsar, Nicholas II, ruled by will and was the sole source of law and justice in the empire. He was not responsible to the parliament. His autocratic rule was supported by the nobles who possessed land and the serfs. The majority in Russia were serfs who worked on the lands of the nobles. The nobles had complete control over the serfs. They could punish them in any form and even sell them as chattels if they felt the need. The middle class in Russia was relatively small in size and did not have much say in matters of the state. They were rather disillusioned by the backwardness that prevailed in Russia. Unhappy with their wretched state, the peasants and workers asked for improvement, which was denied by the Tsarist regime. This led to the two famous revolutions in Russia, one in 1905 and the other in 1917, when the autocratic rule of the Tsar finally ended. Let us learn more about the factors that led to the 1905 revolution. At the beginning of the 20th century, about 85% of the population in Russia was engaged in agriculture. The peasants cultivated most of the land, but the land belonged to the crown, nobility, or the Orthodox Church. The peasants wanted the land of the nobles to be given to them, so they frequently refused to pay rent and at times even murdered the landlords. Industries were found in pockets. With the extension of the railway network and increased foreign investments, the number of industries increased. Coal output doubled and iron steel production quadrupled. Most industries in Russia were the private property of industrialists. Government supervised large factories to ensure minimum wages and limited hours of work. But factory inspectors could not prevent rules from being broken and workers from being exploited. In craft units and smaller workshops, a workday could sometimes extend to 15 hours a day. Accommodation for workers varied from rooms to dormitories. They slept in shifts and could not keep their families with them. Women made up 31% of the factory labor force by 1914, but they were paid less than men. They were paid almost between half and three-quarters of a man's wage. Workers were divided into social groups depending on the level of skill and training required for a job. Despite divisions, workers united to strike when they disagreed with the employers on matters of dismissal or work conditions. All political parties were illegal in Russia. The Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was founded in 1898 by the socialists who were influenced by Marxist idea. However, because of government policing, it had to operate as an illegal organization. It set up a newspaper, mobilized workers, and organized strikes. Socialists were active in the countryside through the late 19th century. They formed the Socialist Revolutionary Party in 1900. This party struggled for peasants' rights and demanded that land belonging to nobles be transferred to peasants. Together, the Social Democrats and Socialist Revolutionaries worked with peasants and workers during the revolution of 1905 to demand a constitution. The year 1904 was a particularly bad one for Russians. They suffered a series of defeats in the Russian-Japanese War because they were ill-equipped and badly trained. This created an atmosphere of discontent. Prices of essential goods rose so quickly that real wages declined by 20%. Workers formed associations for their demands to be heard. When 4 members of one such association, Assembly of Russian Workers, which had been formed in 1904, were dismissed at the Putilov Iron Works, the workers demanded industrial action. Over the next few days, over 100,000 workers in St. Petersburg went on a strike demanding a reduction in the working day to 8 hours, an increase in wages, and improvement in working conditions. On 22nd January 1905, a procession of workers led by Father Gapon reached the Winter Palace to present a petition of demands to the Tsar. Gapon hoped that the Tsar would listen to their demands to reduce the discontent. Instead, the group was attacked by the police and the Cossacks. Over 100 workers were killed and about 300 wounded. The incident, known as the Bloody Sunday, started a series of events that became known as the 1905 Revolution. Strikes took place all over the country, and universities closed down when student bodies staged walkouts. Lawyers, doctors, engineers, and other middle-class workers established the Union of Unions and demanded a constituent assembly. Threatened by the events of the revolution, the Tsar issued a document that promised to guarantee civil liberties. This was known as the October Manifesto. It attempted to check the autocratic power of the Tsar. The Tsar allowed the creation of an elected consultative parliament, or Duma, in May 1906, which he dismissed after 75 days. He re-elected the second Duma within 3 months. In order to restrict people from questioning his authority, he changed the voting laws to ensure the third Duma was packed with conservative politicians. Liberals and revolutionaries did not find representation here. For a brief while during the revolution, there existed a large number of trade unions and factory committees made up of factory workers. However, after 1905, these were declared illegal and severe restrictions were imposed on political activity. What was the demand from the peasants for the lands they were cultivating? Excellent! What was the significance of the October Manifesto? Excellent!
The First World War that was fought between 1914 to 1918 was the result of aggressive nationalism that swept through Europe in the early 20th century. However, the seeds of discontent and formation of alliances between different nations had started as early as the 18th century. In 1914, a war broke out between two such European alliances. The Central Powers that comprised of Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria and Turkey, and the Allied Powers comprising of Russia, France and Britain. Countries like Italy and USA were initially neutral, but later joined the Allied Powers to fight against the Central Powers. In Russia, people were initially very enthusiastic about the war. They also supported the Tsar, Nicholas II, but gradually the popularity of the war declined. The Tsar refused to consult the main parties in Duma. Besides this, anti-German sentiments ran high. This could be noticed when people renamed the city of St. Petersburg, a German name, to Petrograd in 1914. Did you know Petrograd was later renamed as Leningrad in 1924? In 1991, it was renamed back to St. Petersburg. In addition, the fact that the wife of the Tsar, Tsarina Alexandra, was of German origin did not bear well. Furthermore, having poor advisors like monk Grigory Rasputin made the imperial couple highly unpopular. Strategies used in a war generally decide its outcome. The war strategy adopted by the Allied powers during the World War on its two fronts, East and West, was totally different. The army on the Western Front fought the war from trenches. This was known as trench warfare. This resulted in more gains and lesser casualties. In contrast, the army on the Eastern Front had to move long distances to fight battles. They suffered from various logistical disadvantages too. This resulted in a number of casualties and defeats. The Russian army lost badly against Germany and Austria, and by 1917, Russia had over 7 million casualties. As the Russian army retreated, they destroyed crops and buildings along the way. This was done to prevent the enemy to live off the land. The war resulted in over 3 million refugees in Russia. The soldiers did not want to fight such a battle. Such developments undermined the position of the Tsar and his government. The war had a belittling impact on industries globally. Russian industries were no exception. The Russian industries that were few in numbers suffered massively as the supply of industrial goods was completely blocked by Germans who controlled the Baltic Sea. The industrial equipment disintegrated more rapidly in Russia. By 1916, the railway lines in Russia began to break down. The war demanded able-bodied men to join the war, which resulted in shortage of labor in the industries. As a result, small workshops providing essentials were also shut down. Large supplies of grains were sent to feed the army. As a result, there was shortage of food in the cities. This resulted in major riots for bread in Russia by 1916. Which of the following countries supported Germany to form one of the two European alliances? Excellent.
The First World War had an enormous impact on the economy and government of Russia. Shortage of food and hunger strikes prevailed across the country. By the end of February, a large number of workers were on strike. Workers in cities like Petrograd and Moscow came onto the streets demanding higher food rations. The workers were also angered by the social divide. The river Neva that flowed across the capital city of Petrograd seemed to divide the city in two halves. Workers' quarters and factories were mainly placed along the right bank of the Neva. The left bank of the Neva was dominated by elite structures such as the Winter Palace, the official buildings, and the palace where the Duma met. While the elite class living on the left bank of the Neva led a comfortable life, the workers living on the other side of the river suffered food shortages. Triggered by the food shortages and the oppression by the rich, the February Revolution of 1917 began with a wave of strikes. On 22nd February, a lockout took place at a factory on the right bank. The following day, on 23rd February, workers in 50 factories went on strike. Subsequently, men were fired upon and shops were closed. Demonstrations and rallies were held to demand bread. Women also joined the strikes, as a result of which February 23rd came to be known as International Women's Day. Protesters marched from the factory areas to the heart of the capital, the Nevsky Prospect. the workers surrounded the government buildings and other elite quarters. In turn, the government imposed a curfew. On the following day and the day after, the workers returned to protest. Thus, on 25th February, the government suspended the Duma. On 26th February, demonstrators returned to the streets. And on the 27th of February, they ransacked the police headquarters. Soon, all of Petrograd was protesting, with people raising slogans for bread, higher wages, fewer working hours, and democracy. To control the raging crowd, the government instructed the cavalry to fire the demonstrators. However, the cavalry refused and joined forces with the striking workers. Together, they assembled to form the Soviet, or a council. This came to be known as the Petrograd Soviet. This took place in the same building where the Duma met. The Soviet decided that the Tsar, Nicholas II, must abdicate, so they sent a delegation to meet him on 1st March. On 2nd March, the Tsar resigned, following the advice of his military commanders. A new provincial government was formed by the Soviet and Duma leaders. The new government decided to have a constituent assembly that would be elected democratically. Thus, the February Revolution resulted in the resignation of Tsar Nicholas II, the fall of Imperial Russia, and the formation of the Russian Provisional Government. In October 1917, Russia experienced an important transition that heralded a new future. This year has been earmarked in history as it was responsible in transforming Russia into a communist, socialist nation. Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks, a faction of the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labour Party that managed to overthrow the provincial government. The Bolsheviks then established what was popularly known as the Soviet Republic, that is, a workers' state. They also made peace with Germany by signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Bolsheviks under Lenin promised the people peace, land, and bread. They abolished all titles of aristocracy. However, these initial changes were not easily accepted by the rich nobles. Their hostility was curbed with the help of the Red Army, also known as the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. The Bolsheviks seized the property of large landowners and capitalists. They declared that all land belonged to the people. In cities, Bolsheviks imposed the division of large houses according to family requirements. The factories were taken over by the government and handed over to a committee of workers who were to run it. The banks too were nationalized. By 1918, the Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party. Over the years, it was the only party that participated in the parliamentary elections. As a result, the Soviet Republic became a one-party state. Trade unions were kept under the control of the party. a secret police called the Cheka was formed. It punished those who spoke against the new government. The young artists and writers that had been greatly inspired by the Bolshevik ideologies and supported the revolution were soon left disillusioned by the restrictions imposed by the government. By 1921, the economy of the country was no better than what it was during the regime of the Tsars. The workers had proven to be incompetent in running factories. The peasants, too, were hoarding food grains. And added to the wars was a period of severe drought. At this critical juncture, Lenin introduced the new economic policy which aimed at a mixed economy which he called state capitalism. Under the new policy, the Soviet government would have control over major industries, trade, and banking. On the other hand, individuals would be able to sell their food grains in open markets. Individuals could also open their own stores and set up small factories. All these changes helped in improving the Soviets' economic health for some time. After the death of Lenin in 1924, the Soviet once again faced a series of socio-economic upheaval.
The October Revolution of 1917 in Russia led to the Bolsheviks coming to power. Peasants came to believe that it meant free land and end to the war. However, things were not so easy. After assuming power, the Bolsheviks ordered redistribution of land, as a result of which many peasant soldiers began to desert the Russian army as they too wanted to go home and acquire redistributed land. On the other hand, the non-Bolsheviks condemned the October Revolution. These included the socialist revolutionaries called the Greens and the pro-Tsarists called the Whites. The Greens and the Whites decided to fight the socialist uprising of the Reds, that is, the Bolsheviks. They moved to South Russia and organized their troops to fight the Reds. They were supported by the French, American, British and Japanese troops because these nations did not want socialism to enter Russia. The Reds received support from non-Russian nationals and Muslim jihadists. The fight within the country itself between these two sides, the Reds on one side, the Greens and Whites on the other, was the Civil War. It was marked by looting, banditry and the famine. With the rise of Bolsheviks to power, peasants had forcibly seized the lands of the rich and attacked their houses. In retaliation, the Whites resorted to harsh steps. This made the Whites unpopular with the people. Some Russian colonists or landowners too became Bolsheviks and helped the Bolsheviks. But they unleashed terror on the local people in the name of defending socialism. This led to a confusion amongst the people as to what did this government stand for. The Bolsheviks were successful in taking control of most of the Russian Empire by January 1920. In December 1922, the Bolsheviks created the Soviet Union or the USSR from the Russian Empire. To make up for the brutality of the so-called Bolsheviks who had killed the locals, the Bolsheviks gave political autonomy to non-Russians. However, the Bolsheviks combined this popular move with some unpopular policies which they forced on the nations who had joined the USSR to follow. For example, they discouraged nomadic life which used to be prevalent there. Therefore, attempts to win over different nationalities were only partly successful. Various events marked the formation of a socialist society in Russia during the Civil War. Let's find out what they were. The events to establish socialism in Russia during the Civil War were: first and foremost, the Bolsheviks nationalized industries and banks, that is, they were under government control. They also allowed peasants to cultivate the redistributed land. The confiscated land was used for collective work. This land was thus used effectively. The Bolsheviks introduced centralized planning in which officials devised 2 5-year plans. These were for the periods 1927 to 1932 and 1933 to 1938. As part of these plans, the government fixed all prices to promote industrial growth. Centralized planning led to growth in economy, increase in industrial production by 100% for oil, coal and steel, and development of new factory cities. Few provisions were given to factory workers and peasants for development of factory cities. These were creation of an extended schooling system, arrangements for factory workers and peasants to join universities, establishment of creches for children, cheap public health care, and model living quarters. However, the rapid development of factory cities had certain disadvantages as well. These were poor working conditions and hard lives for the workers. Although well-meaning, these benefits could not be enjoyed by all as the government had limited resources. Which process introduced by the Bolsheviks led to economic growth and increase in industrial output? Excellent! What caused the peasant soldiers to desert the Russian army during 1918 to 1919? Excellent! Let us now do a quick recap of the important points learnt in this topic.
In the year 1927-28, Soviet Russia was dealing with the problem of shortage of grain supplies. To overcome the situation, the government fixed the prices at which grains were to be sold. But the peasants refused to sell their produce to the government agencies at these prices. To tackle this crisis, the then leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, implemented strong emergency measures. He believed that rich peasants and traders in the countryside were speculating and as a result were holding stocks in the hope of getting higher prices at a later date. He felt that this kind of speculation had to be stopped and supplies confiscated. In 1928, party members monitored the grain-producing areas, where they supervised and enforced grain collection. Raids were carried out against kulaks or the well-to-do peasants. However, the shortage of grains continued. It was then decided that farms should be collectivized. The reason given for this was small holdings could not be modernized. To be able to have large holdings, the small holdings had to be merged. Thus started the era of Stalin collectivization. The main features of the program that was implemented in 1929 were: individual landholdings were taken away from peasants and they were forced to work in collective farms, kolkhoz. The profit from the collective farming was shared. Even the implements were transferred to the ownership of collective farms. The peasants were not happy with the idea of collective agriculture. One of the ways they resisted this decision was by destroying their livestock. Between 1929 and 1931, the number of cattle fell by 1/3. The government allowed some independent cultivation, but such cultivators were treated unsympathetically. Despite implementing collectivization, agrarian production in the USSR did not increase immediately. To add to the woes, bad harvests for 3 years from 1930 to 33 led to one of the most shattering famines in Soviet history, when over 4 million died. Annoyed at those who opposed collectivization, the government came down harshly against the offenders. They were severely punished, including facing deportation and exile. By 1939, over 2 million people were in prison or labor camps. Majority of those jailed were innocent, but no one was willing to speak up for them. Many, including talented professionals, scholars, thinkers, who raised their voice against collectivization, were charged with conspiracy, tortured, and executed. The idea of collectivization or a workers' state caught the imagination of people around the world. In many countries, communist parties were formed. For example, the Communist Party of Great Britain. In 1920, many non-Russians from outside the USSR participated in the Conference of the Peoples of the East, and Bolshevik founded Communist International or Comintern, which was an international union of pro-Bolshevik socialist parties. Some attended USSR's Communist University of the Workers of the East, thus giving a global face to socialism. However, by 1950s, the world had realized that all was not well in the Soviet Union. Within the country too, people understood that the functioning of the government was not in keeping with the ideals of the Russian Revolution. Though communism had brought in remarkable changes in its industries and way of doing agriculture and managed to feed its poor, but simultaneously, it had deprived its people of their basic freedom through its repressive policies. By the end of the 20th century, USSR's reputation as a socialist country had declined in the international community. What was the purpose behind implementing strong emergency policies such as collectivization in agriculture in Soviet Russia? Excellent. Which of the following reasons was responsible for a decline in USSR's reputation as a socialist country in the international community? Excellent. Let us summarize the main points covered in this session.